February 1933. The United States is still suffering the effects of the Great Depression, a severe economic recession that began in 1929. There is poverty, 1 in 4 citizens is unemployed, and the number is increasing. Hundreds of thousands of Americans are homeless. More than 5,000 banks have failed. Industrial production drops by 50%. Roosevelt has just won the U.S. presidential election, defeating Hoover in November 1932. His recipe for getting out of the economic depression is the so-called New Deal: increase in public spending, a jobs program for the unemployed, incentives to cut agricultural production, financial reforms. February 15, 1933, 9:35 p.m. Roosevelt is giving a speech at night from the back seat of an open-top touring car in Miami, Florida. Giuseppe Zangara, a deranged 32-year-old immigrant from southern Italy, joins the crowd of spectators. He is armed with a 7.65 millimeters revolver that he had purchased a couple of days earlier. Then, coming within 7 meters of Roosevelt, he shouts, "Too many people are starving," and fires 5 shots. He missed his target and instead killed Anton Chermak, the mayor of Chicago. The intended target, Roosevelt, was unharmed. Zangara was executed on March 20, 1933. Indeed, Roosevelt was very lucky. Giuseppe Zangara knew firearms, having fought for years with the Italian army in the Alps during the First World War. What if Zangara had managed to kill Roosevelt? February 17, 1933. Due to his wounds, Roosevelt died at Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami at the age of 51. What happens now? Vice President John Garner becomes the new American president. Garner is cautious in his approach to economic recovery. Only part of Roosevelt's New Deal interventions will be applied. No agricultural adjustment law, which paid farmers to cut their production. No system of old age pensions and other forms of social assistance. The impact on the American economy decreases. More importantly, Garner lacks Roosevelt's charisma, leadership, and personality. The country will not rally behind Garner in the same way, making it harder to pass laws and implement policies, while many Americans are desperate. Someone sees the possibility of taking power. From the first days of his election, a period of instability began. There are hundreds of strikes that block much of the already struggling American economy, often with no result other than many deaths, as there are violent clashes between strikers and police, with police firing into crowds of strikers. Communist trade unions gain support, creating concerns among employers. The American economy began a slow recovery in 1933, but people are not happy. Mussolini in Italy seems to work miracles at the speed of light. In Germany, Hitler took control of a country in similar conditions to Bolivia and transformed it into a world power. Many wonder, what would it be like to have our authoritative strongman in the White House? Newspapers describe the economic situation as catastrophic. People think Garner isn't doing anything. They see him as inept, incapable. There are no expectations of improvement in the economy. Positive expectations are one of the most important factors in emerging from a recession. There is a series of terrorist attacks and bombings. The perpetrators are often never caught. Anarchists are suspected. The governor of Idaho is killed by a bomb in front of his house. The Los Angeles Times building in Los Angeles is destroyed by dynamite, killing 21 workers. In October, a bomb explodes in the waiting room of the U.S. Senate. In this situation, on December 15, 1933, hundreds of thousands of World War I veterans gathered in Washington to protest against a government considered incompetent and inactive. They are organized by the American Legion, a patriotic organization of U.S. war veterans. Many veterans had been out of work since the start of the Great Depression. The event has financial support from the Union Banking Corporation, which provided $3 million to pay for travel, food, and other expenses for the veterans. But behind Union Bank, there is a group that controls assets worth $40 billion, today around $800 billion. They also have guns supplied by Remington Arms. So they have men, weapons, and money, the 3 elements that determine the success of revolutions. From early morning, this massive army of veterans marches through the streets of Washington. Before sunset, the key points of Washington are occupied: bridges, train station, squares. They pitch tents in front of the White House, Congress, the Supreme Court. President Garner orders the protesters removed, but U.S. Army cavalry troops under the command of General Douglas MacArthur remain in their barracks. The protesters are calling for a strong man to resolve the situation. Similar demonstrations begin in other American cities: Indianapolis, San Francisco, Charlotte, Seattle, Boston, New York. The next day, their leaders, among them several former military and American Legion leaders, make their demands. They don't want to depose Garner. They think he needs an assistant, a General Affairs Secretary with special powers, to help him make decisions on how to get the nation out of this grave economic and social situation. They are helpers, not usurpers. Obviously, this is a temporary measure until order is reestablished. President Garner is forced to accept because he doesn't really know how to get the country out of the difficult situation without triggering a bloody civil war. Because he thinks it will be for a limited time, and because he has no other choice, being his own life perhaps at risk. The post of secretary is offered to one of the leaders of the demonstration, General Hugh Johnson. He is a former United States Army officer and businessman. He was born in Fort Scott, Kansas in 1882. He was a member of Franklin D. Roosevelt's Brain Trust. In 1916, he fought in Mexico during the Pancho Villa expedition. December 21st, 1933. Johnson accepts assignment. He will be the United States General Secretary. While the protesters continue to garrison Washington, the powers of the Secretary of General Affairs are established. He will be the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. military and of the National Guard. He will have veto power over any bill passed by Congress. He will be able to suspend sentences pronounced at federal level. He can issue executive orders that cannot be challenged by the judicial authorities for violation of the Constitution. The Secretary of General Affairs will be assisted by the American Liberty League, a committee composed of the most prominent businessmen and bankers of the United States, and several high-ranking military personnel and politicians, all people with great experience and competence. The Liberty League, or Patriots League, probably the real leadership of the country, has the role of advising the Secretary and can remove him if necessary. The Liberty League will be disbanded as soon as the situation returns to normal, but no specific date is indicated. Slowly, the protesters abandon Washington. Around 15,000 veterans, especially those left without jobs, decide to remain as security forces, a paramilitary army accountable only to the General Secretary and paid for by the Liberty League. The uniform shirts has a scarlet eagle, symbol of USA, over the heart. The General Secretary and the Liberty League will have their headquarters in the Executive Office Building in Washington. The first measures concern the restoration of public order. Martial law is declared, another prerogative of the General Secretary. Terrorist attacks and much of the unrest cease, increasing support for the new political system. Trade unions linked to anarchist or communist movements are banned. There will be several reforms to stabilize the financial markets. Banks are reopened with federal loans, state assistance to families with children. The end of Prohibition era, increasing public revenues, and creating around 1 million jobs related to the alcohol industry. There is a tax cut for large industries. The powers that support Johnson will use all their immense economic power to help him. The mainstream newspapers are constantly talking about how things are constantly improving. Wages are increased and working conditions are improved. In exchange, American industries receive billions in weapons contracts from the U.S. War Production Board, because a huge help to stimulate the economy will be given by a huge increase in military spending. Unemployment falls significantly, and in 1934 the United States emerged from recession. However, the Great Depression ended around 1933 to 1934 all over the world, from Australia to South America, regardless of whether there was a communist, fascist, or democratic government, even in those countries that did almost nothing. It even ended with the plethora of federal agencies and counterproductive economic policies pursued by Roosevelt. So sooner or later it will end up in the USA too. These successes are attributed to Johnson's new leadership, Just as in our timeline they were attributed to Roosevelt, there are other measures. All immigration from China and other unwanted Asian and Arab countries is banned, but immigration from Eastern Europe and South America is also restricted. There is a centralization of political power. The role of the state governors is reduced. The second wave of KKK continues to grow, and in 1936 it has more than 4 million members. It will become a tool of American government to do the dirty jobs. A network of youth groups and summer camps is established. The age of the children varies from 6 to 18 years old, boys and girls. There are swimming pools, archery competitions, forest walks, musical bands, and parties. Only children of European origin are allowed in these camps. Asians and Spaniards are not welcome. Blacks, not even talking about it. Executive Order 6161. Starting from 1935, concentration camps are created, officially called internment camps, relocation areas, or citizen isolation centers. Here, all people considered potentially dangerous or forcibly transferred, together with their families. Political adversaries like Huey Long, but also criminals, immigrants, mentally ill people. The confinement is intended to mitigate a security risk for a limited period of time until the situation stabilizes, but several people will remain there for years. The camps also serve as a segregation center for individuals and families who were to be deported in other countries. At least 100,000 people will be locked up in these camps. Retired General Smedley Butler was the Liberty League's first choice for General Secretary, but he declined. Armed with a blanket arrest warrant, the FBI seized him on January 20th, 1934. He was detained in municipal jails and then transferred with his family to a relocation area. Here he died in 1940 of cancer. Jews are also targeted. The camps are in fact enclaves, little towns built in very isolated, undeveloped, and harsh regions. In lands heavily forested, desertic, or swampy, surrounded by barbed wire fences and monitored by military police. The camp are often still under construction when the first inmates begin to arrive. The camp hosts schools, a hospital, and residential blocks based on designs for military barracks, each with dozens of buildings divided into multiple apartments as well as communal toilets. Some camp have their own food production where crops are harvested at the site by agricultural workers. Some camp administrations allow relatively free movements. Part of the inmates have the permission to leave the camps to live and work elsewhere in the United States under supervision of a family or agency whose loyalty is assured. If you think it could not happen here, this is exactly what happened to Japanese, Italians, and Germans during World War II. Japan has been at war with China since 1931. The United States remains rather isolationist. There will be no sanctions or embargoes. Indeed, relations with militarist Japan are rather good. Since 1934, the military dominance over the Japanese government continues to grow. Without a war in Europe, an attack on the British, French, or Dutch colonies would be too risky. There will be no Pearl Harbor. The United States, which began rearmament in 1934, is scary. In the Japanese Army, the faction that supports the Northern Expansion Doctrine, or Northern Road, win. This doctrine states that Siberia is Japan's sphere of interest, but this plan is abandoned in 1939 after the defeat in the battles of Khalkhin Gol. The Japanese will focus their efforts on China. Philippine independence is stopped. The Philippines will follow the same path as Hawaii, becoming another star in the American flag. MacArthur is sent to the Philippines. The main reason is to distance him from Washington. 1936, the United States presidential election is won by Prescott Bush. 1939, the Spanish War ends with Franco's victory. The United States, like other countries, ignores the embargo on all arms exports to Spain and allows large shipments to Franco's troops. Relations with Germany and Italy are improving and remain colder with France and United Kingdom. A wave of fascist organizations is taking over Europe. Hungary, Romania, Portugal, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Greece. In France, Netherlands, Norway, and Britain, ultra-nationalist groups are also increasing their popularity. In 1938, Germany annexes Austria and then Bohemia. In the 1930s, European fascist regimes were viewed in a positive light not only by part of the American ruling class. Today, the superiority of democracy is self-evident to everybody, but the mere moral appeals rarely bring food on the table. When democracies fails to deliver prosperity and political stability, as during the Great Depression, the tide of popular opinion could lead the people to seek alternatives, such as communism in Russia and fascism in Italy and Germany. In USA, however, this is more of a right-wing conservative government than a true fascist dictatorship. The real fascism was only performed in Italy. However, each of the countries, Spain, Germany, and others, set up their own fascist systems based on the various social and cultural histories of those countries. For example, Germany was more focused on the militaristic and racial aspects, maintaining a capitalistic economy. USA will be more similar to the German version. The real event that ended the Great Depression and caused a huge acceleration of the economy was the advent of the Second World War. This is why Roosevelt tried everything to have a war. He sent weapons to the Axis enemies. The list of provocations against Germany and Italy in the Atlantic is endless. He slapped sanctions on Japan, froze Japan's bank assets. Roosevelt asked for war, and he got it. But there is no need to go to other continents to have a war. Mexico, under the presidency of Lázaro Cárdenas, has strong left-wing connotations. Cárdenas made a 6-year economic plan based on the Soviet Union's 5-year plan, massive land reform programs. He nationalized the railway system and other left-leaning reforms. The Mexican government helped the communists during the Spanish Civil War. In 1938, it was one of only 2 governments to openly condemn the annexation of Austria into Germany. In March 1938, Cárdenas decides to nationalize of all petroleum reserves, facilities, and foreign oil companies in Mexico. All the U.S. and Anglo-Dutch oil company are expropriated. This sparks violent protests, and after a few weeks, without even an ultimatum or a declaration of war, Mexico is invaded. What weapons would the U.S. Army have? Since the U.S. rearmament began earlier than in our timeline, we can assume that the U.S. military in 1938 would have had more advanced weapons and in greater numbers. America's main battle tank is the M2 medium tank. There are about 200 of them. The armament consists of 137mm cannon and up to 7.62mm Browning M1919 machine guns. There are 800 MA2 light tanks, a twin turret tank with a 37mm cannon. There are 200 M1S, a light tank armed with machine guns, 600 CTL-3, the first M3 Lee. The U.S. Air Force has 3,000 aircraft. The standard bomber is the B-18, a 2-engine aircraft. The Northrop A-17 is the standard attack aircraft, and the Curtiss P-36 the standard fighter. The U.S. Air Force already has 100 B-17S, almost impossible for the Mexicans to shut down. The Mexican Army is no match for the United States. In the 1930s, it is very degraded after almost 30 years of civil war and military uprisings. There are 50 small infantry battalions and 40 cavalry regiments scattered in separate garrisons throughout the country to maintain local order. 2 artillery regiments armed with the French 75 light field gun. The Mexicans keep what little artillery they have near Mexico City, as well as the anti-aircraft guns and the tankettes, mainly Marmon Harrington CBTL. There are also the rural militias, some 60,000 peasants, something like a gendarmerie. The soldiers have locally made small arms, licensed Mauser rifles, Mendoza LMG-2 machine gun. The infantry support weapon is a version of the 60mm French Brandt mortar. Their air force consists of less than 100 biplanes. After some initial debacle, for sure the Mexicans are military more skilled soldiers than the Americans. The American Army advances in Mexico. Among their commanders are Eisenhower and Patton. There will be a naval blockade to stop Soviet aid, the landing in Veracruz. Alongside the USA, there are also South American contingents, of which the Brazilian one is the largest. Executive Order 9066. 300,000 Mexican who have emigrated to the USA and Americans of Mexican origin must leave the territory of California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas for confinement sites in the hinterland, as happened to the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. The presence of potential saboteurs is feared. They are housed at horse racetracks or fairgrounds. Wooden and tar paper barracks are constructed for additional housing, as well as unpartitioned toilets, camp bed for beds. The situation in the Mexican internment camps is bad and worsening rapidly. In 1939, after the fall of Mexico City, Mexico surrenders. The USA annexes the Southern California and the eastern regions, rich of oil. Nicolas Rodriguez Carrasco is the new Mexican leader of a right-wing government supported by USA. During the war with Mexico, the military service became mandatory for all male citizens, but it will remain mandatory also after the war. After the defeat of Mexico, much of Central and South America is aligned with USA. In Chile, the nationalist socialist movement rules, after a coup d'etat backed by the USA that placed General Ibáñez to power. In Paraguay, the USA manages to keep Colonel Rafael Franco in power. In Peru, there is a military junta. Bolivia, in 1936, Colonel David Toro overthrew President Tejada in a military coup. Uruguay, there is the strong nationalist dictatorship of Gabriel Terra. Brazil is under Vargas, a dictator. In Ecuador, there is a military junta. In Panama, the canal is occupied by U.S. Marines. The leader of Panama is Arnolfo Arias, a strong admirer of Italian fascism. Cuba is under Batista, supported by the United States. There will be neither the communist revolution nor Castro. Guatemala, the General Jorge Ubico is in power, supported by the United States. Nicaragua has been occupied by U.S. Marines since 1912. American troops landed in Honduras in 1934. San Salvador, after a military coup, is led by a military civic directory, Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez president. Costa Rican President Leon Cortés Castro is an admirer of Nazi Germany. The massive war spending doubled economic growth rates, and the mobilization of manpower following the outbreak of war with Mexico ended unemployment, moving approximately 10 million people into the war labor force. This finally eliminated the last effects from the Great Depression. In 1940, Bush is re-elected with an overwhelming majority of votes. 1939, Germany and Russia attack Poland. Without American support, France and the United Kingdom do not declare war on Germany, limiting themselves to diplomatic protests and sanctions. However, Hitler never was interested in a war with the British. 1941. Since there is no pro-British coup d'etat in Yugoslavia, Operation Barbarossa begins earlier in May. Germany and its Axis allies invade the Soviet Union. Without a war in the West, the Soviets would expect a German attack. But in 1940, the French too expected the Germans' attack. Changed nothing. General Motors factories continues to build trucks, bomber engines, and tanks for Wehrmacht. The American Lend-Lease program starts supplying Axis with oil, food, and materials. USA remains officially non-belligerent, but sympathizes with the Axis powers. Johnson agrees that American people would be permitted to enlist privately in the German army immediately after the start of Barbarossa operation, seen as an anti-communist crusade. By July 1941, around 100,000 men volunteer. Many of them are professional soldiers given leave from the American Army, including many veterans of the Mexican War, and nearly a third of the volunteers are students. On the 13th of July, 1941, the first ship leaves New York for Hamburg. Then the soldiers are transported by train to Grafenwohr, Bavaria, for 5 weeks of training. Here they become the German Army's 229th, 234th, 235th, 236th Infantry Divisions. The soldiers cannot use official American Army uniforms, so they wear the German Army field gray uniform, the Feldgrau, with a shield on the upper right sleeve bearing the word America and the USA national colors. Each division is divided into 3 infantry regiments, as in the standard German model. The regiments are named after the American cities that volunteers largely originated from. They are equipped with the Mauser Karabiner 98K, MP-18, MG-34 machine guns. Each regiment is supported by an artillery regiment using 75mm guns, 105mm guns, LEF-H-18, 150mm guns, FH-18 heavy field howitzer, anti-tank guns, 37mm PaK-36 and 75mm PaK-40. Each division also has some Stug 3. There are enough men left over to create an assault battalion, mainly armed with MP-38 submachine guns, sent in Finland. It will have high losses. Aviator volunteers form the Eagle Squadron, Adler Geschwader, using Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190. On September, the 4 divisions are formally incorporated into the German Wehrmacht. They are initially assigned to Army Group Center, the force advancing towards Moscow. The divisions are transported by train to Suwałki, Poland. Then they have to continue by foot on a 900-kilometer march. Lida in Belarus, Vilnius, Malatzyekna, Minsk, Orsha to Smolensk, and from there to the Moscow front. At Smolensk, part of the American volunteers are rerouted and assigned to Army Group North, the force closing on Leningrad, becoming part of the German 16th Army. They are first deployed on the Volkhov River front, with its headquarters in Novgorod. They are in charge of a 50-kilometer section of the front along the banks of the Volkhov River and Lake Ilmen. In spring 1942, they are transferred north to the southeastern flank of the siege of Leningrad, just south of the Neva River. Japan remains a threat in the east, so the Soviets cannot deploy the Siberian divisions in Europe. Moscow falls in the summer of 1942, causing the retreat of the Red Army on the Urals. This ends the fightings in Europe.
What happens next? After the victory, the American divisions are withdrawn. There will be a victory parade in New York to celebrate the victorious conclusion of the war. Close to 3,000 American volunteers refuse to return and are absorbed into other German units. They will be sent to the Caucasus. Stalin is soon deposed. Beria follows, but communism collapses before 1946, in a Russia still under embargo. The Sino-Japanese War ends in 1943 with a Japanese victory. The Japanese get Manchukuo, Mengjiang, East China, Xiamen, Xiapu, Hainan, and Fujian. Chiang Kai-shek's China is increasingly supported by the USA. Without the Soviet Union's help, Mao's communists will be defeated in the next few years. After the defeat in China, communism is swept away from history. Colonialism will last longer. Without the Second World War, the European powers are not weakened. The Russian regions will gradually regain their independence. Maintaining occupation in those lands facing guerrilla warfare every day would have worn out the Wehrmacht without any gain. Without the devastations caused by the Second World War, Britain remains a world power, with the biggest fleet in the world. The USA will mainly develop a land army. Only India will gain independence after 1940, staying united and moving closer to the Axis and America in the following years. Segregation in the USA will last much longer, and some of the rules will be applied to Jews, Asians, and after the war with Mexico, Hispanics. The USA will never join the Axis, but they will maintain good relationships, especially with Germany, similar to those that the USA has with Great Britain in our timeline. There will be joint projects to produce tanks that could equip both armies. The P-51 will have a Messerschmitt engine. The Manhattan Project. Germans and Americans exchanged nuclear information, but only combined their efforts in the final stages. The Italian Enrico Fermi will probably remain in Italy. In 1944, Charles Lindbergh becomes the American president. So, this is the new world. The story ends here.